Okay, this is the final sort of question you get on the Russia-Soviet Union paper. And this is question 4. This is 16 marks, and very importantly, you get 4 extra marks for your spelling, punctuation, and your grammar. Now, that means that if you use historical keywords, you spell them correctly, you use capital letters, and your punctuation is good, you can actually get 4 extra marks. It's really important. This is worth 20 marks out of the 52. Now, in terms of what you need to do for this question, it's always a how far do you agree question. Okay, so how far do you agree with a certain interpretation? So in this case, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the success of Stalin's 5-year plans? Now, what this means is that you need both sides of the argument. So you need to agree with interpretation 2, but also have a counter argument. Now, you will have looked at these 2 interpretations before in an earlier question, but this time you need to read what it says in interpretation 2, you need to use quotes, and then support it with your own knowledge. So, for example, interpretation 2 states that there was incompetence during the 5-year plans, that there was human misery, starvation, death and disease. Okay, so for example, we know from our own knowledge that the 5-year plans did lead to human misery, death and disease. We know that it had an impact on workers freezing to death whilst building Magnitogorsk. We know, for example, that the focus of some of the 5-year plans was so much on heavy industry like oil and coal and iron that they forgot about things, consumer goods for people. So actually they were so busy on rebuilding the army, building factories, that people were actually starving to death. We also know that workers, kulaks for example, or workers who were viewed as not hitting targets, were executed or sent to the gulags. So there are aspects of interpretation 2. It says interpretation 1 here, but that's just a mistake. It's interpretation 1 and 2 that are true, and we can support that with our own knowledge. So we use a quote and we support it with our own knowledge. Then what you have to do is you also have to have a look at interpretation 1 and say the other side of the argument. So for example, here it does say that the 5-year plans were a success. For example, it led to modern houses, hospitals and workers' clubs, childcare, new cities were built, and in the new cities and under the 5-year plans, much more had been accomplished than anybody thought. So one interpretation says the 5-year plans were a success. The other interpretation says that the 5-year plans were a failure and led to bad consequences. Now, what you need to do, and the structure of this, is relatively straightforward. In your introduction, explain what the 5-year plans were and whether or not you agree with interpretation 2's judgment that they were a failure. Then you do 2 or 3 paragraphs where you argue supporting the information in interpretation 2. So you pick a quote from interpretation 2. So, for example, that the 5-year plans led to human misery, and then you link that to your own knowledge and you explain how that was the case. Now you do 2 or 3 paragraphs where you are suggesting that, for example, it led to disease and death under the peasantry, or there was incompetence at the centre, that the 5-year plans were a failure. Then you do the other side of the argument where you're suggesting that things were a success. So you link to your own knowledge about childcare, you link to your own knowledge about housing, you link to your own knowledge about hospitals or workers' clubs, you link to your own knowledge about the accomplishments of the 5-year plans. So, introduction with a clear judgment about whether you agree or disagree with interpretation 2. 2 to 3 paragraphs arguing one side of the argument, quotes and own knowledge. Then 2 to 3 paragraphs arguing the counter-argument, quotes and own knowledge. And then a clear overall judgment in a conclusion where you state how far you agree with the interpretation in the question. You should be looking to write at least 2 to 3, possibly 4, 5 sides of A4. This is worth 20 marks out of 52. You need to leave time, at least sort of 28, 30 minutes to do that question properly. Okay, this is another example of the 16-mark question. Question 4, 16 marks plus you got your 4 for spags, so that's 20 altogether. Now, this one, again, as always, is a how far do you agree question. Now, when you're thinking about this, how far do you agree? What does this mean? It means that you have to show both sides of the argument and you have to come to a judgment. There is a controversy here, or there is a difference of opinion about the reasons behind the Red Army's success. It'll always be a question that is a success, failure, or different reasons for something happening. And in this case, you've got two interpretations about why the Red Army won the Russian Civil War. Now it says, look at interpretation 2 and how far do you agree with those reasons. So, interpretation 2, if we look at it, what reasons does it suggest why the Red Army won the Russian Civil War? So it talks about the Cheka, it talks about torture, okay? It also talks about the idea that Lenin thought terror was necessary and that millions of peasants died and that the Bolsheviks terrorized the people. So interpretation 2 suggests that the Bolsheviks, the Red Army, won the Russian Civil War due to terror, the secret police, and things like that. Now, on the other side, interpretation 2 gives different reasons. For example, the brilliance of the Red Army, the weaknesses of the whites, Trotsky's role, okay, coupled with propaganda and the use of Pravda, their newspaper. So you have two different sides of the argument here. And again, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you are quoting the interpretations and also putting in your own knowledge to support it. So, for example, interpretation 2 says that millions of peasants died during the Great Famine. Now, you know that that's true. You can support it with your own knowledge. We know that 3 to 5 million peasants died during the Great Famine during the Russian Civil War. And what caused this? War communism caused it, because 5 million people were conscripted into the Red Army. All of the grain and all of the food was requisitioned and given to the army, so people starved to death. Now, Lenin thought that this was necessary to win the Russian Civil War, so we can link that to our own knowledge. In the same way, on the other side, we can link the role of Trotsky, for example. We know that Trotsky played a key role. He was the general of the Red Army. He travelled around in his armoured train. He displayed heroic madness in the defence of Petrograd. So both sides use quotes, use your own knowledge, and then at the end, in your conclusion, you come to a 100% clear judgment of whether you agree with interpretation 2 or whether you don't.